Hey y'all, welcome to the first sidebar of season 3. Shelonda. Girl, I've decided not to associate any themes with the sidebar for this season. Instead, I've opted to just go through the episodes and have a candid dialogue. There's really no telling where that might go. We'll see. But as usual, we have to recap. The end of season 2 was emotional. After about a year of dysfunction, Antonio gave Shelonda one good week leading up to the trip to Hawaii. After that week, she saw all the best parts of him, reminding her of why she fell in love with him. On the night before they were set to leave, Sharon popped up and let Shelonda know that she and Antonio had been grooming her to either be a stripper or a prostitute. Only Antonio fell in love with Shelonda. With the full understanding that Antonio had officially chosen Shelonda, Sharon decided to kill her and make Antonio watch. Only he got in the way and was killed instead. Unable to take that, Sharon killed herself as well. Shelonda plans the funerals and meets with Antonio's lawyer a month later, where she was given a heart-wrenching letter that was handwritten by Antonio. She also goes to a coffee shop where she runs into her new kin, and we all know what that means. So, now we're caught up. Episode 1, My Guy. I don't know. Maybe the theme for these sidebars should be repetition. I don't know if y'all have noticed, but this is actually the second episode that's titled My Guy. The first episode of season 2 is titled My Guy as well. In that episode, Shelonda flashes forward and talks about her day leading up to a night out with her new guy. And at the end of that episode, you find out that the new guy is Antonio. The reason why I did that was not for lack of creativity. I titled them the same to create the understanding that Shelonda is a creature of habit to some degree. The exact same thing happens in the My Guy episode in season 3, only this time we realize that Shelonda is a much different person. Shelonda prepares for this date with the understanding that she's absolutely stunning. She mentions that she typically prefers that her dates pick her up, but everything about this situation is atypical. As the story goes along, you'll realize how atypical it really is. After arriving at the restaurant, she tells the hostess that she has a 7 o'clock reservation. The hostess says, "Oh, you do?" apparently in a very snooty manner. Shelonda, who has obviously not lost her flair for the dramatics, takes off her designer sunglasses and says, "Listen, sweetheart, I can only assume that your procrastination is a habit of the poor, as people of my status understand that time is money. Now, would you like to lead me to my table, or do I need to tell your manager how much you like to waste time?" Hostess girl was like, yikes. Anyway, Shelonda says that her date is the richest man there, and the hostess doesn't have to ask to whom she's referring. She leads her directly to his table. Once they arrive, Shelonda's date asks if she wants anything. She says, "Yes. Can you bring me a whipped daughter, please?" Sidebar. I'm going to go ahead and tell y'all now, I am not an exotic alcohol drinker, but what I am is a researcher and a strategist. Prior to the writing of this project, I had no idea what any of these drinks were. I researched things for the sole purpose of making them fit into the storyline. So, there are some variations, but a whipped daughter is basically some form of chocolate liqueur with a whipped cream topping. That was Shelonda's request, an obvious play on the whole whipped cream on the chocolate thing. They sit and talk, and Shelonda mentions that her date is quite dry, so what's the appeal? That's when she drops the bomb. Her new guy is David L. Herkowitz Esquire, Antonio's lawyer. Episode 2, I Couldn't Leave. If you know Shelonda like I hope you do, and I hope you're starting to by this point, you realize that this is usually the point of reflection. Shelonda has dropped the bomb just like she did when we found out that she was dealing with Antonio. Now she has to go back and elaborate on how the situation came to be. And by her own admission, the reason is relatively simple. It boiled down to what it always boiled down to with her: need and vulnerability. Now, I don't want this to get too elaborate because it was all stated in the episode, but I think it's important to recount some specifics. Shelonda realized that every man in her life arrives at a very vulnerable time, and that's what allowed them to play the part that they played. She hates that Ron is even a part of the conversation, and I do too, but he really is essential. Ron came along when Shelonda felt ugly and she was being bullied in school. He purchased clothes for her and told her that she was as pretty as the other girls. It was a horribly predatory thing, but Ron cued into what she needed and played into it. And once he started to abuse her, he started to make it up to her by buying her things and getting her hair done. By the time she saw him for who he was, Ken came along. She was physically and emotionally vulnerable. Yeah, repetition should be the theme of this sidebar. Shelonda saw Ken as an attractive boy in her age range, but he was also a safe haven from what she was dealing with at home. By the time he got around to being abusive, she was receptive to it because it was normal for her. She was able to still see the good in him. I think Shelonda makes an important point about her relationship with Ken and sums it up perfectly. She says, Ken was flawed in so many areas, but he loved me. I firmly believe that, even still, Ken didn't have much, but he was willing to share whatever he had. That's what I needed at the time. I needed to be a priority to someone, and I was. He would have done anything for me, but that was the thing about Ken. He would have given me the shirt off of his back, but we'd always have to share that shirt. We couldn't ever have advanced in the way that we needed to. Our life together wasn't set up that way. Ken didn't have the means or life skills to maintain a relationship as an adult. He was a sadly misguided child that tried to live an adult's life. In fact, we both were. Ken and I never should have lived together. After the misfortune of my situation with Mom and Ron, I should have moved in with Grandma. That would have been the best thing for me. We were so anxious to grow up, so anxious to live our lives as adults. The expectations were unrealistic in every way. One of the biggest flaws in my relationship with Ken was expecting an adult situation from a child, also expecting to be an adult situation as a child. Now, I won't dig into the depth of love between the two of them, as that's always up for interpretation. But the part that I want to elaborate on is the part about the shirt and the part about them growing up too fast. In reflective mode, Shelonda realizes that her life with Ken would have been stagnant. He was never prepared to be anything more than what he was, as she would have taken that ride with him because she loved him. And it's absolutely true that they shouldn't have lived together. One of her biggest flaws was expecting an adult situation from a child and also expecting to be in an adult situation as a child. And that leads to Antonio. Shelonda was vulnerable because Ken's absence left her with a lot of time on her hands. And it also left her without his financial assistance. And of course, Shelonda realized that Antonio was more mature than Ken. After dealing with the fear and hurt attached to Ron and Ken, Antonio was a breath of fresh air. He never made her feel afraid. But when he got locked up, Angel was able to come in because the space was available. And she always needed someone to fill the space. When it was time for Antonio to come home, Shelonda's vulnerability welcomed him back. She didn't necessarily need him financially, but she needed to mean something to someone, and Antonio provided that. And once he died, David existed for the same reason that all the others did. Shelonda was vulnerable. It wasn't about money or getting out of an abusive situation. Shelonda was emotionally vulnerable. To explain the depths of her emotional vulnerability, Shelonda recounts her meeting of David. We now know that he was the guy that she met at the coffee shop, right after she left his office to get what Antonio left for her. She was emotionally deflated, and he made her smile. David didn't call Shelonda for 3 weeks, which comes into play later. But that's not really on her mind because she spends that time depressed and going through the contents of her keepsake box. If at no other point in time during this podcast, the keepsake box will become more and more relevant over the course of this season. I'm not going to go over each item, but Shelonda pulls out each thing and mentally recounts how she acquired it, She also mourns the loss of the people associated with those items, from Ken to Grandma to Tasha, Cassidy, Peaches, and Sharon. She always ends the session with Antonio's letter, and that seems to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. She ends up crying herself to sleep and holding the letter to her chest. She mentions that David comes along to change that. Sidebar. I had this conversation with a friend of mine who's listening to this in real time. I actually call her friend. So when you hear this, hey friend. But I told her that I wish I had thought to elaborate on something in the last sidebar of season 2. Talking about it now gives me an excellent opportunity to redeem myself. Now, if this was a real situation and Shelonda was a real person, I think her hurt would have been amplified by something that was much bigger than what was stated. One of the items in the keepsake box was the ring that Antonio gave to Shelonda. I think it's important to note that it wasn't just a ring, and it wasn't just an engagement ring. The symbolism of that ring is major. Throughout the entire series, Antonio had multiple women. He had told all of them that he couldn't ever be faithful to one woman. He had given entire speeches about how that way of life was unfair, but he wasn't going to promise anything different. After all, he was the anemone and he collected the clownfish. But a week before everything happened, he made a point to show Shelonda how things could be between them. And on that day, he officially let Sharon go, like she was an employee. Shelonda knows this because Sharon said it. Shelonda found that ring in Antonio's pocket. So he planned to go into that bedroom and propose to her, then go to Hawaii the next day. The man that swore he couldn't ever be with one woman had finally decided that it was her. And after everything that she had gone through to get to that point, she had to watch him die. She had to watch him die, and she had to feel like everything that she had gone through to get him had contributed to his death. Now, 43-year-old Chinney doesn't believe in the type of toxicity that Shelonda had to endure to eventually get that ring. But at 25, I probably would have felt exactly like that. But I really just wanted to include that little bit of layering to pull at your heartstrings, because I want you to imagine Shelonda feeling that way every single day after Antonio's death. That was the emotion that I was attempting to evoke, because I needed her to be in that place in order for her to be receptive to what happens next. Episode 3. This is Shelly. Shelonda's minding her business, being all sad on a random Wednesday, when her phone rings. David is on the other end, and he casually says, "I told you I'd call, like it ain't been 3 weeks." Nonetheless, he asked Shelonda out on a date that following Friday, and she accepts. Accepting the invitation gives Shelonda a sense of purpose. For the first time since Antonio died, she has a reason to prepare for something. Her hair is a mess, so she decides to take out her braids. But because they were the braids that she was wearing when Antonio dies, she has a whole entire emotional breakdown while taking them out. That girl loved that man. Eventually, she got him out. She cut off the end of one of the braids and put it in the keepsake box. Because if you've not noticed, anything with an emotional connection is going to end up in that box. So that's Wednesday. Thursday, she shops for the date. Something that she hasn't done since Antonio died. The only part of that day that I want to touch on is the symbolism of her nail design. Initially, she gets the nail tech to place a diamond and a gold line on one fingernail. That makes her think of the diamond in Cream's tooth and Peaches' bottom row of gold teeth. She finds it funny that they are once again forced into a space together, just as they had been in real life. But then she decides to have the nail tech redesign the art. The French manicure reminded her of Antonio. She gets a star on one finger, a diamond on one finger, and a gold line on the other. That was representative of their positions within the hierarchy, and Shelonda's way of keeping them all with her. She decides to always have her nails designed that way. She feels good, and per the normal Shelonda repetition, something happens. David starts saving her. Without him even doing much, he's providing an avenue for her to stop thinking about Antonio. And that's the formula for success with her. The man comes along and pulls her out of something. Friday rolls along, and it's the day of the actual date. Shelonda is excited, and for the first time, she's actually early. I'll tell you now that time will become a huge part of this story. She arrives at the bar and stands outside. Now she's nervous for two reasons. She realizes that she doesn't have a lot of experience with dating. Antonio and Angel were her only examples, and they were very similar in the types of experiences that they provided. 2, this is when she explains that David is white. Sidebar. I've had many conversations about the fact that David was a white guy, and it was always surprising to me that it never hit most people until that very moment. I mean, I was hoping that it wouldn't for the purpose of dramatics, but I kind of thought that people would pick up on it based on the fact that his last name was Herkowitz. I don't know, I'm from Southampton County. The black people that I know have last names like Smith or Taylor or Green. Anyway, David is white, and that causes some apprehension for Shelonda based on how she was raised. But after thinking about the fact that she doesn't place a lot of value in her upbringing, she decides to go in. But after getting inside, however, she's struck with that same apprehension because she realizes that she doesn't really fit, like based on how she's dressed. She starts to feel like she did when she arrived at the school dance in the 7th grade, looking like a Rooster Chia Pet. She's going to leave, but David spots her, so she can't. She walks over to his table, where he introduces her to his friends. He excuses her attire by saying, "That's how you do dress down Friday," or some variation thereof. By her own admission, she realizes that what happens next was completely unacceptable. Yet, she allowed it to happen. David turned to her and introduced her as Shelly. Not Shelonda, Shelly, taking every bit of the ethnicity out of her name. Episode 4, The Legal Group. Shelonda was thrown off, even though she doesn't challenge David or correct him because she doesn't want to make things awkward. Instead, she morphs into the type of person who she believes will be accepted. She changes her natural pattern of speaking and her mannerisms to reflect those of the group, and she feels good about the fact that they seem to accept it. She says that she suddenly becomes Shelly, and she falls into the role as quickly as she fell into being Star. Her only bother was the fact that the conversations lacked the type of genuine nature that she shared with her previous circle. Another thing that I found interesting is how easily Shelonda was convinced to take the drink. By Shelonda's own admission, she had been offered drinks by Cream and Peaches, and she usually declined. Yet, she was very easily convinced by the legal group. It wasn't stated, and it's left to the listener's interpretation as to why, but my personal feeling is that Shelonda perceived the legal group differently. Thus, she had more of a vested interest in fitting in. In her previous group, she was the preferred standard, but in that setting, she didn't necessarily feel that she measured up, so she had to do what it took to fit. I think that's not only obvious in the fact that she accepted the drink, but also in the fact that she watched Mandy and attempted to mimic the way she sipped her drink in hopes that she came across in a similar manner. Sidebar. Speaking of the drink, the knockout. I've mentioned before that I have no actual experience in the consumption of any of these drinks. So let me tell you a funny story. Well, a story. I don't know if it's actually really funny, but... So, when I wrote these books, the drink didn't initially have a name. It was just a generic margarita. But the Shandora in me ended up doing some research, and I ran across the knockout, which is a martini, not a margarita. I thought it was a better fit for the storyline for a few reasons. First of all, it's called the knockout, and we all know that she eventually passes out, so it's a good play on words. Secondly, the combination of alcohols was far too much for someone who doesn't really drink, so it kind of made more sense for Shelonda to think she had simply had too much and passed out. The issue ended up being in the fact that I'm my own one-stop shop. I not only write my own stories, but I edit and publish them as well. Consequently, sometimes things get past me. Once I decided to use the knockout, I started referencing it as a martini. But because it initially was supposed to be a margarita, there were a couple of places in the book where I forgot to change it to a martini. So it's a martini in a couple of places and a margarita in some others. Most people didn't notice either way because they were so caught up in the storyline. But there's always one person who's the professional noticer. A person that I know, a former friend of mine, contacted me and let me know that she'd noticed. Mind you, she was a person who had been finding minuscule things to critique about this entire project. I thanked her for bringing it to my attention, but I guess that wasn't enough because she told me that the whole thing threw her off because she wasn't sure if the drink was a margarita or a martini, as if that made the difference in what eventually happened in the story. Needless to say, we're no longer friends. And no, it's not because she didn't Google to see if the knockout was a margarita or a martini. Anyway, that went so left. But let me tell you, Chinney can tell a story about anything. Back to the real story. Shelonda takes the drink and starts to notice the dynamics of the group. She notices that the men seem to dominate the conversations and the women seem to be mere accessories. And because of her preconceived notions, she believes that this is so because the women are weak. She realizes that they wouldn't participate in the snapback like her previous circle. And she thinks that this is because they're white. At any rate, the other couples leave and she enjoys some alone time with David. She declines his offer to have another drink, and that's all she remembers. Episode 5, The Signs Were There. Again, this is repetitive. There's an episode with the same title in season 1, and that was intentional as well. In season 1, The Signs Were There episode is when Shelonda moved in with Ken and he puts his hands on her for the first time. Afterwards, there was an escalation in the abuse. There were some things that Shelonda should have paid attention to, but she chose to ignore them in lieu of seeing the best in Ken. Now, in season 3, the signs were there as well. Shelonda wakes up in an unfamiliar room. She's in a bed, fully clothed, with a monstrous headache. When she steps down onto the floor, her legs were wobbly. She finally finds David and asks what happened, and he was able to convince her that she had 4 martinis. She only remembers having had 1. For a second, she considered the fact that she may have been drugged, but she can't see any reason why he would have done so. Now, I can understand the fact that she hadn't ever really been drunk before, but I don't know if I would have gone for that. I get the headache, but Mr. Wobbly Legs and no memory, that's a lot off of some alcohol, but she let it go. David takes Shelonda to a car, and without asking, he knew exactly which one was hers. When asked how, David said he had been following her and had gone through her stuff while she was asleep. Something in her felt weird, but she let it go because he explained it away. He saw her keys and there was a Jaguar emblem on them. Shelonda goes on her way. After that, she didn't hear from David for 2 weeks. I accidentally said 3, but the take was pretty good otherwise, so I just let it go. But it was 2 weeks. And even though nothing about the date was particularly successful, Shelonda was bothered by the fact that David didn't reach out to her. Consequently, she starts to critique herself. She starts to wonder if she did something to make him break contact. And that's a trigger for her because she hates rejection. It always makes her want the other person more. So when David pops up 2 weeks later, she was more than happy to be receptive towards him because she was relieved that she hadn't messed things up. And he was, in fact, still interested. He invites her right back out to that same bar, and she agrees that Friday and many Fridays thereafter. So, that's it for this sidebar. The next episode is titled, Ooh, the Proposition. I think you probably already know that David has some mess with him, but he's really about to show you just how deep that goes. I'll let some more build up, and we'll catch up on the next sidebar with Chinney. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Chinney Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh, yeah. You're welcome. Shine, little girl.